Dive in. I want to talk a little bit today about animating in Cinema 4D and specifically using the graph editor and talking about a few animation principles and how we might be able to use those in an animation. Let me see, did I have a camera set up here? So I've been playing around this week a little bit with doing a ball bounce animation in Cinema 4D. And a couple different takes here. Let me see if I can just show you a little bit of what I was working on, and then we can talk about, let's see. And let me know if this stream is choking up a little bit. Mike, Anya, hello, hello. So let's see. I think I need to maybe make this window a little smaller so I'm not blocking anything. There we go. I don't want to block any of my settings on my screen here. So what was this one? This was just my regular ball bounce, where I'm actually just kind of playing with the geometry on the 3D ball, squashing and stretching it just on its Y. And let's see, we can take a look at it in the 2D mode here. You can kind of see. And the first thing I'll bring your attention to is here in the timeline, you can see that I'm actually using some hold frames. That's the first thing I want to talk about is, even though it might not be technically right, we also have this principle called exaggeration in animation, where it's really more important how it looks than actually what's going on. So I have this ball falling down here to the ground plane and then actually holding on the ground for 1, 2, 3, almost 4 frames on the ground, so I can really exaggerate the squash and the stretch on the ball, and hopefully you can kind of see that. And let me get in here real close and hit S on my keyboard. I'm just going to pull out ever so slightly, and I'll even take off the scale. Let me just look at the position of using some hold frames here. I need to zoom way out. And that's just as simple, right, as setting a keyframe. Right, bringing it to the ground, and then I sort of sticking a keyframe, and then I squash it. A pretty crazy amount. Let's see, I'm getting an error here. Are you guys seeing the stream okay? It's not lagging for you? Okay, well, good. So let's just go ahead and start a new project and talk a little bit about animating inside of Cinema 4D. So I'm going to create a sphere. First off, I'm going to go into my 2D view here and go ahead and move this even with the ground plane there. The next thing I'm going to do, because I know that I want to really stretch this geometry around and make it really, really squashy and stretchy, is I'm going to up the segments. I'm going to double it. I'm going to say 50 segments. And I'm also going to turn the geometry from standard squares to icosahedrons, which is going to take a distribution of triangles, essentially. So that is about all the setup I'm going to need to do on this guy. And I'm not going to use the squash and stretch deformer or anything. I'm just going to play with this guy just as it is. So let's talk a little bit about keyframing here. I'm going to go to my coordinates, and hopefully you can see it. I should be streaming at 1080p, but over here on the coordinates of this object, I really only need to animate the Y property on this sphere to get my kind of up-down motion going. So I'm just going to start near the top of the frame. I'm going to control-click this empty circle next to the Y property. The other thing I need to do is make this scene a little longer. So I'm going to say about 200 frames, which is just shy of 10 seconds. And let's see, I keep getting a program error here. Okay, so that should be good. So now I can go back to the first frame, kind of start up, control-click on that empty circle, go forward, I'm going to zero out that property. All right, so I got my first keyframe. So I want to talk a little bit about the timeline. You see, as I'm starting to lay keyframes, it just lays these kind of key-looking guys, these little rectangles. I'm going to hit the space bar to turn it to graph mode, because I just want to see it with splines. And now at this point, I can basically kind of work in my timeline. I'm just going to copy-paste that first keyframe. I'm going to drop it a little bit down. I'm just going to kind of eyeball this. I just want to block in my animation. So I'm just copy and pasting the existing frames over time, and I'm just going to very quickly get this shot of this bounce blocked in just as quickly as I can. And I'm just going to do a super straightforward bounce where we just kind of have this decay where it bounces a little bit less each time. And also the bounces will have to get a little bit shorter. And none of our spacing is a consideration yet. We're just worried about timing at this point. Smooth for me, lagging. Okay, I just lowered the bit rate on the stream a little bit, so hopefully it gets fixed up here. So this is one of my favorite ways to animate in Cinema 4D, is just get some first data in and then just do it all with splines. It makes me feel like I have a lot of control, and I just feel like it's a lot quicker. The other way to go about it, if you can even manage to see it on the stream, here in this bottom timeline, there are little frames as well that I can work with, little keys. But I really don't like that. It's so small, it's like impossible to click on them. I feel like it's about the easiest way to go about this is just to do it straight up with splines. So I'll say bounce, bounce, bounce. So that's probably enough. And we may even kill that last bounce, but we'll see. Now what I'm going to do is grab all these bottom keys. I'm going to go into key, say break tangents, because what I want to do next is start to work on the spacing, right? If I've got the timing roughly correct, the next thing to do would be to mess with the spacing, and that is possible to affect the spacing with these splines, just like in After Effects, right? So it doesn't change the overall timing. The bounces still happen on the same keys, but I'm changing the interpolation between the frames. And I'm not going to break the tangents on the top of these, so I can get that nice kind of bounce feel at the top. I may even have to pull these back a little. I just kind of want to see it in the snappier version first. So you can already tell some of these bounces are a little too long. So this is the other thing I love about just getting to splines as quickly as possible, is you can start to eyeball and see and say, well, I think I need to scoot this in ever so slightly. I can see that this guy needs to go this direction. I can see that this is looking a little long. Let's see, I'm going to hit S to zoom in here. Get down into the details a little bit. So what this last frame is telling me is that it's going to ease into place. I don't want that. I want it to kind of thud to a stop on the last bounce. And we're just going to get that kind of poppy motion. I'm going to hit H to frame all of my splines again. And now I can start to look at kind of some of the timing and the spacing. So that last bounce is a little wonky, isn't it? Another thing I think we could do is make it a little more playful, a little more cartoony, and play with some of these bounces a little more. Maybe the second bounce is a little higher, actually. And then the decay is like more extreme, where it just, I think that needs to be smoothed out a little bit. Because that last bounce feels way too tall. That needs to come way in and down. And I'm going to frame up this last part of the bounce by selecting it and hitting S on my keyboard. And these need to be, and sometimes you got to pull these back just a touch. So I'm going to hit H, come back out. So this should be a slightly different take. Big bounce, small bounce. And again, this isn't super perfect or naturalistic, I should say. Just being a little more playful, just want to get some interesting timing so we can talk about animating in here. So that guy needs to choke up a little bit. I'm just going to watch it for another second here. So let's talk a little bit about what I was saying at the beginning of these hold frames so we can do some really playful squash and stretch. I'm just going to select everything from the top of the second bounce over and pull that out a little bit. I'm just going to grab this bottom keyframe, and I really need to get in here and see a little better. I think I'm going to have it, I think my squash will be, let's just do 3 frames. So I'm going to select this one, hit Command-C, Command-V, just copy and paste it. Then all I need to do is grab the first key. And what do we do here? I think just this button right here. So that is linear interpolation, right? That's this kind of broken tangent looking icon up here in the panel. Let me make sure I'm not missing any questions. Smooth now, good. Thank you, Kamal. So that's going to give me the basis of my hold, right? Now, if we look at it in real time, it's just going to appear to sit on the ground for that extra, that extra moment. But that's going to give me the blocking I need to get in there and do something really interesting, hopefully, on this first one. So I am going to, should we just do it with our Y property here? I mean, we could just deform the geometry. So let's go ahead and let's try that. So let's say at the top of this bounce, the Y property and the X, so I'm going to have to do 2 here. The Y and the X is sitting where it should. Then by the time it gets to this first contact frame, I want it to be really stretchy. So let's just go to 2. Actually, let's do 1.75. And then I need to pull in on the X. Oh, that's way too much. Let's go to 0.75. I'm going to put those keys in. And then in the middle of the hold, this is where my squash comes in. So I'm going to hit 1 on the Y. Okay, so let's go to 2 on X and pull down. I'm just going to try to shape this a little bit, and we can change it, and I'm mostly just kind of blocking it in. So it's going to look super wonky at first. And then by the time it's leaving, I basically want to, and now I can kind of do as I was doing before. And look, let's look at these simultaneously. I'll select both. So here's my stretch pose into a squash pose. Then I need to get back to a stretch pose. So I'm just going to copy and paste these X and Y values to start getting that going. It's not going to look right at first. We're going to have to mess with it a little bit. We can probably extend our squash pose, ease our squash pose a little bit. And then it's going to go up. And then by the time it's almost to its top of its ascent here, it should probably be, oops. What I meant to do is frame this. What it should probably be doing is going back to its regular shape. So let's get in here. So get back to 1 on X, get back to 1 on Y. Let's set those keyframes. You can kind of see that update here with the splines. And we've got the beginnings. We've got the makings of our squash and our stretch pose here. Now, if we wanted to do a little bit of, let me make sure I'm not missing any questions or anything. If we wanted to do another kind of squashy, stretchy moment on this guy, on this one too, the first thing we're going to need is a bit of a hold frame, right? Because we want it to kind of stay in its position till probably right about here. So I'm going to go back and say, let's kind of start over on that. So this hold in the middle, where it's just going to keep its normal shape. And then I'm actually going to borrow our keyframes from before, hit Command-C, Command-V, And I'm just going to have this same animation. Now I'm going to have to back it off because it wouldn't be that extreme on a shorter bounce. So what we can do is say, you know, let's not be so extreme on this one. We'll kind of back it off a little bit. And the same on the X. And I'm pulling towards 1. If you can see, it says 1.2, it says 0.8. So this line down the middle here is 1. This is like kind of back to normal. And the squash pose, again, is going to be too extreme, so we need to, I think, back off on that guy a little bit as well. You can start to see it taking its regular shape again. So I'll hit H here. And then we need to get it back to 1 and 1 on the X and the Y there. Boing. And it's going to look messed up until we kind of play with it a little bit. Let's go back to my position here. And I didn't do a hold frame here on the second one, did I? So allow me to, we'll go to 71. I'll pull that first one, I'll set it to linear. Okay, now I've got another hold. And I need to make sure that I am timed up properly here. And if I zoom way in, so you can see, so this is my hold. This represents my hold, where it's just sitting on the ground plane. And these represent my squash and my stretch, my X and my Y, that are kind of working against each other here. So you can see it starts to squash. It's actually pretty perfect. That worked out good. Squash. Actually, that worked out pretty good, even though I have it 1 frame late. Let's see. I'm going to back out on this a little. I'm going to make this third bounce go up a little bit more, I think. So the big takeaway so far I want everyone to have is just getting comfortable with splines in Cinema 4D. And you don't have to do your ball bounce animation, obviously, in C4D. I just want to, this is going to be part of kind of a bigger initiative on my part to try to do more C4D stuff for the website. Just because it's such a good tool. And if you're going to learn to work with splines and After Effects, you know, it's not a huge leap to work with splines inside of Cinema 4D because the principles are effectively the same. Now, not if you're talking about the velocity graph, right? In After Effects, there are 2 types of graph, the properties graph and the velocity or the speed graph. What we're doing is working with the real properties. There's no velocity graph per se in Cinema 4D. Everything is just the actual values. That's why when you change this, it actually changes in real time in your scene because we are manipulating the values here. So I don't have any squash and stretch on the final ones. I can see that this bounce is looking a little lethargic. I'm going to tighten that up, make it a little snappier. I'm going to take a look at it again here. All right, so we got the start of something super simple, super basic. And the next thing I kind of want to talk about is actually rendering this shot and kind of setting up a basic little scene. Because the other thing I want everyone to have a pretty decent grasp on is actually working in Cinema 4D, exporting from Cinema 4D, and working with some really basic things. Travis says, never thought about a hold with a bounce. Oh, Travis, that's Animator's Survival Kit 101, man. Those holds in there, which is good, which is a good way of thinking about it, because whatever the camera sees is what we're really after. So on some of these other scenes, I tried to set them up super simple. Let me just hit render here. And let's see, I think I should have rendered my little ball test here. So on this one, I was trying to play around with this first bounce and do something kind of like a Play-Doh. And I was kind of trying to mess with a kind of a Play-Doh-like texture or some kind of super ball, just something random, using a little bit of color theory here to have this kind of pink environment, but cutting against it with blue. And we could talk a little bit about the texture on this sphere. Let me get a little closer on it and see if we can see. And when I look at that close, it's that checkerboard material is looking a little crazy. So let's just start fresh. Okay, so this is super basic, super beginner type stuff here. But I'm going to add a floor. I'm going to add a single light in the scene. We'll just throw it up top. Let me not go too far. I don't want to go crazy. Now the way that we're going to create, I guess I could look back at my Finder. The way that we're going to create this fall off is actually with the light. So let's talk a little bit about working with this light. Because if I just go ahead and take a look at what the Omni light gives me, it'll give me a little bit of a fall off, but it's basically kind of all the way to the edge of the floor. I want to narrow that fall off. So I'm going to go into the details of this light, and there's a little tab that says fall off. I'm just going to say inverse square physically accurate. And this actually allows me to control the fall off of this light. So we'll just kind of keep it in this general area. It should be a lot shorter. I'm going to grab a fill light so I can actually see what I'm doing here, because I don't want to use global illumination. I typically try to avoid global illumination whenever possible and just try to fake it. Like on this one, I've got kind of a fill light in the front to give me my bounce if I'm not going to use global illumination to actually bounce any light in the scene. Let's just go ahead and put that guy in. I think I turned it down way too much. There we go. So let's just play with some materials here. Let's create a floor material that's like super hot orange. Because why not? Okay. So what would be a complement? A complementary color to orange is sort of a blue or a blue-green opposite the color wheel. So let's go back to that blue. Now, as I said before, as I was trying to do maybe something more like a Play-Doh, the first thing I started to play with was the bump. And the bump, when you first enable it, it doesn't show you anything. Everything is still perfectly smooth and textured. So we need to get some information into the texture channel, and the easiest way to do that is to just use a noise pattern, which we could adjust. So right off the bat, it starts to look almost kind of like a plastic ball. And I'm going to turn off my specular for the time being. And the specular, if you're not familiar with that idea, is, and let me pull this width down. The specular is that little hot specular highlight, that little hot light that you see on the edge of things or the rim of things. And if we turn off the bump, you'll see a clear example. Now, because we have a bump channel, it's distributing that specular to the top of each of the bumps, right? So let's just pull the specular back for now. Make sure I don't miss any questions. Toby says, can you talk about using dynamics or deformers versus using keyframes? Yes, we can get into that in a moment, Toby. That's a good question. So in the noise, the great thing about just a simple kind of noise pattern is there's a lot of ways to distribute it. So you see that's really, really fine and more smooth, which I think is giving us something interesting, gaseous. And I would definitely encourage you to just play with these settings, see what these are giving you. There's really no way, unless you do it a ton, to kind of memorize exactly what's going on with each of these noise distributions. But I'm just going to kind of pick something that maybe we try to do something more like a gymnasium ball, like a rubber ball. So we do a little bump. The other thing we could do is add some diffusion that affects the luminance. And again, I'm going to use a noise. And diffusion means it kind of dampens the light out of it. It darkens it. And you can choose for your diffusion channel to affect the luminance, the reflection, the specular. So you got a lot of control over what this is actually going to do. And again, with just a straight kind of noise pattern, you can see all the ways that we could darken it. And it definitely looks way too strong right now, but this is actually a super important principle because there is diffusion on various things. There are little spots on things all over the world that kind of drown light out, right? So let's see, and we could pull this way, way back with our mix and our strength here, actually. So this is the mix strength here at the bottom, right? So we could pull that all the way off. You see we kind of get back to where we were. Push it in a little bit. So let's go ahead and apply this guy. All right, so we've got this little ball. The other thing I was kind of doing in my other scenes was just making sure I had a super simple area shadow so I could play with this kind of contact a little bit. And it looks like my floor might need to be, well, it should be pretty lined up. Okay, last thing I'll say on this front is, as I was playing with renders a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about render settings. Adding really fine texture details into an object like this can be a little bit tricky to render. And the way that I have found to kind of manage that, so let's say we were going to set this up, I'm going to say all frames, I want to render the full animation, I'm working at 24, is to go into anti-aliasing and say best. Turn up those minimum levels 2 by 2. And then here I think is the really important setting, which is some type of Gaussian filter, so that some of those fine details, you don't want to get that marching ants look where everything is trying to recalculate perfectly. So having a kind of Gaussian filter should allow your render to get away with some maybe some more fine details. And you can always turn the anti-aliasing up super, super high. Of course, that's going to take longer to render. Okay, super quick overview. Talked about working directly in the graph editor here. Let's see. Yeah, dynamics, love nothing. Honestly, I don't do really much of anything with dynamics in Cinema 4D. I think your question about, now obviously dynamics are a super useful tool in the right scenario. I think, if you've got a shot where you just need a super naturalistic, there's a thing of blocks or something and you just need it to fall over and be perfect and naturalistic and you don't need to be able to tweak the final outcome very much, then dynamics is a great way to go about figuring that out. But to your other question, Toby, about actual deformers, so on this squash and stretch where I was having some real fun, just getting like super cartoony, pancake style here, I actually was using the squash and stretch deformer. So let's just talk super quickly about how that gets utilized. It's very simple. So let's say if we take a sphere, I'll use triangles on my distribution here. And then we'll go ahead and add the squash and stretch deformer. And we could definitely take a whole nother day and just talk deformers. I will make the sphere a child. I believe that's right. Or is it vice versa? No, it should be a child of the deformer, right? Nope, opposite. Oh, that's funny. But I have it the child there, but it's in a null. All right, either way. So the deformer menu is super useful. There's so much you can do with it, especially if you don't have really any rigging knowledge whatsoever, and you don't want to actually affect that base geometry. Then there's a whole lot in here that's really, really, really useful. Now I'm running an older version of C4D, so there might even be some updates within this. But the squash and stretch one is super useful. And it appears to run basically on this setting called factor. We can really push this, right, and get that like pancake shape. So another thing I was having an issue with is if you don't have enough polygons on your object, that's why we have this tool called a hypernerb. A hypernerb is going to add more geometry to your base shape. So you see it started to smooth out the edge of that circle, and it adds all these new polygons, and if I pull it out, you see I'm left with kind of the base geometry. Now, it's pretty common to work with polygons in a more low poly state, because you can always turn your hypernerb on and off. So if your scene starts to get really crazy and complex, working with less polygons, and then before you render, turning on those hypernerbs to get everything perfect, can be an acceptable way to work with a scene that's got too much information that's being processed. So that is definitely a good tool worth mentioning. Let's see, people are happy about the holds, textured timing for the win. Yeah, I agree with Ryan. I think if you can create timing that is more textured or more interesting or more dynamic, I always think that's a better outcome. So let's see. Okay, that's basically what I wanted to talk about. The big takeaway, I hope, is working in the graph editor. I would really encourage you to spend some time, do a simple ball bounce, do really, really simple animations, get comfortable with how this works in terms of being able to get right into the timeline, work with splines, dial things in just as you want, comfortable with kind of the just the tool set generally, being able to frame things up or zoom in. There's always this kind of push-pull where you've got your keys. So 1 is just a pan, 2 is kind of a stretch, zoom, and it's all on the mouse, and that's all good, but I'm a big user of just hitting S to frame things, and sometimes you still got to zoom in a bit, or hitting H to frame everything. If it's a scale issue here, we could hit H just to look at these properties, and then zoom back out here to look at the position properties. So it's just a super useful thing to know how to do. We will look more at animating inside of Cinema 4D as the semester goes on. I think it's super important for all motion designers to have a grasp of this tool. Even if you want to do work that's exclusively 2D in style, there's still so much that Cinema 4D can do for us, even to make it look 2D, but just avoiding some of the clunky 3D stuff inside of After Effects is, for my money, the way that I like to go about it. So, yep, dynamics are great, but I think it's probably pretty limited in terms of what a true animator is going to need, So, okay, hopefully that's helpful in some ways. Let's see. I'm going to hang out for a minute if there's any questions about this week's assignment. Next week, we're going to spend our Thursday morning session just looking at some of the animations that have been produced, because we'll be into week 3. And so that'll be exciting, kind of see, and I've been seeing the PDFs come in and seeing lots of great concepts, lots of fun stuff. So let's see. Let me try to split screen this guy. All right, yeah, hopefully the stream picked up a little bit for everybody. And yeah, if there's any questions, please reach out, let me know. How's everybody feeling about their ball bounce animations here in week 2? Of course, some of you are in class 2 and not doing the ball bounce, and that's okay. So do I use Sketch and Tune a lot? I do not use Sketch and Tune a lot. But what's worth mentioning is EJ's new product here. And this is not a plug so much as I think it's actually just a really great tool. He actually, so for $85 here, EJ will give you, he's got 900, he's saying production-ready cell shader materials. if you're going to do a ton of stuff with cell shading, this is probably a really great resource, actually. The sketch, like this guy's master of sketch and tune, right? So if you're interested in that kind of sketch and tune stuff, EJ does more on this than anybody I've seen online. So I would say definitely, if you're not going to buy the kit, just like look at some of his free tutorials. And he uses it to really great effect. And you can even see some examples here of just how powerful you can get that 2D look, but with the dynamism of 3D, which is just so, so nice, right? Because if you need to move the camera or you want it to spin or anything like that, as opposed to working with flat Illustrator files. So I'm a big fan of using 3D to get that 2D look. And EJ has been a huge inspiration and super helpful of just deconstructing so much of how the sketch and tune engine works, and with each new update, the things that they're changing. So he's a really fantastic resource for that stuff. Let's see. One of the challenges I am facing is how do you animate the sphere without it looking like a droplet in After Effects? So it sounds like you're saying you'd like it to have more kind of rounded edges as opposed to kind of a teardrop. I'm not totally sure what you mean by that or how you're getting that, unless you're trying to do your squash and stretch by actually changing the shape, changing the mask. Are you affecting the squash and the stretch by using kind of the scale properties, like the Y and the X scale properties? And maybe that's something we can discuss. Changing the X and the Y, it's looking like a droplet. I assume you mean it just is not looking rounded enough on the edges for you. And that is, again, I think, maybe it's an instance where you need to kind of cheat it a little bit and get the exact shape you want. And this is also why we wanted our first shots to be really, really short, so that if you need to get in there and change and get the shape you want on a squash and a stretch, either by cutting the layer, using a new shape on those bounce frames. I'd be interested to take a look at your project and see kind of what issue you're getting. But you could just mean, the shape that it's producing by changing the X and the Y properties. Yeah, hit me up on DM if you want to send me any screenshots. Maybe we could go back and forth a bit on it today. Yep, EJ's great. That's really good stuff. Okay, thanks everybody for hanging out. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for your patience. Coming down with the flu here, so I'm a little backed up. The kids had it, and then the wife had it, and it's just going one by one here. It's been quite a flu season, but hopefully everybody's doing really good on week 2. Any questions, you know where to find me. And we'll be back next week with more MoGraph Mentor HQ Live. Thanks, everybody. Bye.